the question I started asking myself was, what are we doing to ourselves when we tell ourselves we're consumers 3,000 odd times a day? Like, that's the limit of your agency. The assumption that you are a kind of narrowly self-interested creature. And when you're surrounded with that story, like whether that's true or not, and over time I've become increasingly convinced, and now absolutely kind of insistent that human beings are not lazy and selfish, that we're creative, participatory, kind of empathic, wonderful creatures. But when we surround ourselves with a story like that, with that much persistence, that much pervasiveness, then it is going to influence how we behave and all of what we do.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with me, Dan Burgess. Welcome to episode 40 of the Spaceship Earth podcast. This is Dan. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you're all going okay out there. I have to say, I'm feeling a bit frazzled of late. Too much time on Zoom, juggling too many projects, and feeling a bit maxed out, to be honest, with the whole bonkerness of 2020. Very much craving some wild time and desperate to get in the ocean, actually. So let's see. Anyway, back to the episode. In this episode 40, I'm in conversation with Jon Alexander. Now, Jon is a founder of the new Citizenship Project. He's a strategist, an activist, and a citizen, and he's possibly the smartest man I've ever met. Jon's been dedicating his life exploring how we might shift from a passive consumer-led culture to becoming citizen-led, active participants, co-creating the world around us. Jon, like me, spent several years of his early professional life working strategically to help big brands sell more stuff through creative communications. But Jon, not like me, is the real deal. He's reimagining big stuff, like the future of democracy and stuff like that. Jon just kicked off the Athens Democracy Forum last week with an opening provocation. Now, this is a big event. It features Yuval Harari. So Jon is well worth listening to, I believe, and particularly at this time more than ever, his work, I think, is really is very valuable right now. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation. This conversation was actually recorded back in June. It's taken me a little while to get back on top, but let's cut to it. This is episode 40 of the Spaceship Earth podcast with Jon Alexander of the new Citizenship Project. Enjoy. So, Jon, welcome to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, good to connect. We've been trying for a while, and appreciate your time. Obviously, we are. I was trying to land the context of these things. It always takes me a couple of weeks to get these things out, but we're sort of. I've lost some facts. We're middle of June-ish, aren't we? Something like that. So we're still sort of. I don't know. Are we in lockdown? Are we not in lockdown? Where are you? Give us a bit of context. Where are you at?
Where am I? Who knows? So I am currently sat in my house in Sevenoaks in Kent, which I'm feeling remarkably fortunate to be in, particularly as until about 11 months ago, my partner and I lived in a one-bed flat without a garden in Wandsworth, and so we feel like we have sort of timed our retreat from the big city pretty well, to be honest.
Yeah. And have you been? That's where you've been the whole lockdown. That's been base camp for you.
Yeah, pretty much. The joy of it's been that we haven't had to sort of be inside all the time because we're sort of out of the city, so we've got fairly decent access to sort of getting on bikes and running and so forth, which is important to both of us. Although I did manage to have a crash the other day and fracture a bone in my shoulder, so that's I've been a bit more confined to pretty much exactly this spot for a little bit more than the last few weeks.
There's something about kind of physical accidents and lockdowns going on. I've experienced the same. I've just got to let the cat out. Hold on a second. Come on.
While you're doing that, I saw a brilliant cartoon the other day about Brexit, which was a picture of a cat, the cat as Britain waiting at a patio door, and waiting to be let out and scratching at it. And then as soon as the door was opened, it didn't go through, which I thought was a nice metaphor. Anyway,
Brilliant. So listen, we're going to get into a bit of your story before we get into the new citizenship work and what you're deeply into right now, and I guess and how this work that you've been pursuing for many years is starting to really show up at the moment. Now, but just for the context of my listeners, I mean, we share a bit of a thread in kind of how we first connected. Sort of, I was trying to sort of like articulate what it was. Sort of like, I think we kind of connect around the sort of deeply disturbing concept of consumerism, right, as the sort of core idea in our sort of society, and the role of creativity in that story. That was our sort of connection a few years back.
I think as I remember it, we so you and I have known each other, it must be over a decade now, and kind of, and as you say, the journey was sort of interwoven from the beginning, and we've bounced back and forth off one another along the way. But as I remember it was like that we were in that kind of we were two of the about 7 people in that first wave of people in the broad sort of advertising industry, thinking, hang on a minute, we're involved in this climate change thing, aren't we? And I think what was yours was Naked Planet, was it? And I think ours was mine. I think briefly I held the utterly ridiculous title of head of creative responsibility at Fallon.
Well, we were trying, weren't we? We were trying.
We still are, my friend.
We still are. It's true, but there is, exactly. And I think that's an interesting. And I guess on that's what I'd love to know, because I know my listener, a lot of listeners just really enjoy listening to kind of like these transitions that people have made, and I think it's really kind of pertinent at this moment as well, because I think my sense is also a lot of people are kind of really thinking about the work they do right now, and I think, and I love your story. Would you just give us a bit of that, because I think that'd be useful, which gets us to today.
Yeah, sure. I guess I mean, it really starts for me kind of pretty much at the beginning of my career. So when I was at university, my only real aspiration was to be a sportsman. I used to row quite seriously and wanted to sort of do that forever. But it became fairly crunchingly obvious that I wasn't good enough, unfortunately, or big enough. I'll give myself good, but not big enough. And I stumbled into the advertising industry really kind of more by accident than anything else, kind of wanting to do something creative, but something not, and something sort of with a bit of joy to it, and that rather than be a kind of banker or a consultant. And I was in that kind of that milk round thing, and I'll say stumbled into advertising, but fairly quickly started asking questions about like, what are we really doing in the world? And I remember like looking back, there's this a day when early on, one of my first bosses said to me, like, what you've got to remember is that the average consumer sees something like 3,000 commercial messages a day, and your job is to cut through that. And I remember, like, even at that time, like for a couple of years, he wanted me to like focus on the second part, right? Your job is to cut through that. Like, it's a competition for the attention of the consumer. And I was pretty good at it for a little while, but even then I was kind of focused in on the first part, like 3,000 messages a day. 3,000, like,
that's probably triple that now.
Or maybe, Well, I mean,
just pre-digital,
pre-Facebook and I mean, I guess that where it eventually got me to was like the question I started asking myself was, what are we doing to ourselves when we tell ourselves we're consumers 3,000 odd times a day? Like, if you consider all of those messages to have the underlying kind of the unifying kind of proposition that your role in society is to choose between stuff, then that's the limit of your agency. And also a sort of implication that you are the assumption that you are a kind of narrowly self-interested creature. And when you're surrounded with that story, like whether that's true or not, and over time I've become increasingly convinced, and now absolutely kind of insistent that human beings are not lazy and selfish, that we're creative, participatory, kind of empathic, wonderful creatures. But when we surround ourselves with a story like that, with that much persistence, that much pervasiveness, then it is going to influence how we behave and all of what we do. And so I mean, I got to that really over 4 or 5 years working in advertising, and then I wrote.
Because I remember there was that work, because I remember, that's when we were sort of connecting about that, and there was that sort of, I guess that's sort of tension, frustration of being in this thing and thinking, can I provoke it? Can I throw spanners into it? Can I find ways to, open up the space for this? And it was really difficult work. And when you're sort of also unraveling yourself of really what's going on. But I remember because you wrote, or you co-wrote that paper with, was it Tom Crompton?
That's right. Yeah, and Greg Darshall, who's now a very prominent campaigner at Friends of the Earth and done a lot of work on land reform. So yeah, Tom, who's sort of the guy on cultural values, and I and Guy worked together on this thing, a piece that was published under the title "Think of Me as Evil: Opening the Ethical Debates in Advertising." It was the title was drawn from a quote from a guy called Rory Sutherland, who's big name ad man, and he said, "I'd rather be thought of as evil than useless." So we were like, "Okay, we'll take that." But no, I mean, I'm being a bit facetious. Like, it was a deliberate thing to do, to say, okay, we need to ask some bigger questions. And in a way, Rory was actually quite embracing of that and responded to it quite constructively. But what we were doing was going, like, does advertising increase consumption or just redistribute it? What's the evidence? Because so many of these questions just hadn't really been stared into. And what does is advertising's influence on cultural values? Like, what is the evidence? What's the influence of any particular advert on cultural values? Is advertising a mirror or a molder? And of course, like in a lot of these things, the answers are pretty bleeding obvious, but just no one had really pulled together the evidence. So that was a big part of it. But what was, I guess where I was and where you were and where a few of us were kind of trying to, at that time, sort of what was it, sort of 2009, 2010, go, can we use the skills of advertising to sell greener stuff, basically, to change. And I think, I mean, it worries me that some of the conversation is still there a decade on. And I think where writing that paper took me was to like, it's not enough just to change what you advertise and what we have to do. And it's not even enough just to affect advertising. Where I got to was, what we're doing is we're constructing a narrative, a frame through which the whole of society is formed and shaped and structured, and that is the level at which we have to shift our thinking and have to shift our practice. So it's not just like consume other stuff. It's not even just advertising or a bit less advertising. It's how do we construct a story or make space for a story, probably better, of people as something more than consumers, as able to sort of and construct the opportunities for people to be participants, not just choosers. And so it was interesting. Like, I think, I don't know if you remember this, but around the same time as Think of Me as Evil came out, it was a bit of a Jerry Maguire moment for me, to use an early 2000s cultural reference. But I ended up leaving and going to work for the National Trust on a project, and the project was called My Farm, where we handed over decision-making on a real working farm to the public by online vote and debate, as a way of involving people in sustainable food rather than just selling them a different food product, like be in the decisions. And I mean, lots of stuff was wrong with it, but the thing I'm proudest of about that was it sort of framed the second question for me. So if the first is what are we doing to ourselves when we tell ourselves we're consumers, the second that built up around My Farm was, what if we could bring the same kind of creativity that currently goes into flogging stuff to people to bear on involving people? So what, like, and a few years on, sort of having gone and dug into it academically again for a little bit, that was really the sort of seed crystal of the new Citizenship Project as an organisation. The question, like, why is consumerism so creative when participation is so boring? And how can we kind of bring some of the joy and energy and insight and creativity of Adland, I guess, but more broadly, kind of brand and thinking, creative strategy to bear on citizenship and participation.
And that was because I remember, it's interesting, two things you're talking about, like, some of those early questions you were asking was like, the sort of constructing new narratives versus, I think, where certainly, you know, how I've seen your work develop and how you talk about this stuff is you increasingly got to the point where it's like, no, we need to create the space. And i.e. sort of like, I remember speaking to you about this last year, I think it was, but you know, this idea of, can we change the story? You know, can we bring new narratives into culture? But actually, this sense that the sort of pervasiveness of commercial creativity is so deep and so kind of everywhere that actually it's almost to sort of bring forth these kind of new ideas or allow people to kind of experience them. How do you actually, you know, how do you actually give them the space that they can see them? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Or that there is another possibility. Was that clear early on for you, or is that sort of, I don't, you know, because there's always a jump. There's always it's particularly when you think about communications practices or networks or organizations. There's always a sense we can tell, you know, we can tell something. But actually, at least through my work and stuff, it means more and more like, you know, we have to experience something. We have to participate in something in order to sort of feel that there is something possible.
I think that's true. I mean, I think in a way that in my mind, you're kind of bridging two different questions in what you've just said. Like, I think one of the things that I am very, I guess, very insistent on now is I think that we have to look at both what needs to stop and what needs to be created. Like I think it's too easy to argue. Too easy. I don't quite. Too much energy can too easily go into kind of, we can create a different cultural narrative. We can form a different story and that doesn't have the kind of the clarity and the kind of the analytical rigor to say, actually, there's stuff that needs to be dismantled in order for that new to have space. So for every lovely film or whatever or that we can make that sort of, or experience we can design that enables people to sort of to be participants. If they go, if 4 hours of television a day, or if the insistent sort of Facebook scroll or whatever is riven with the message that you're a consumer, then unless we understand that is a competing frame and a constricting frame that actually stops the oxygen for that sort of deeper idea of self to emerge, unless we stare into that as well, then we're just doing nice stuff. We're just entertaining ourselves. We're just keeping ourselves happy and assuaging our guilt rather than actually taking on the structural challenge. And I think that's something I've become more and more kind of passionate about and convinced of. Like we need to build the dream and construct the citizen world and so on and so forth, but we do fundamentally need to dismantle the consumer story as well. And actually the most joyful work for me, and I think the excitement, is in when you find the pivot points between the two.
Can you give us any sense of what that looks like?
Well, I guess, I mean, the most, at a really literal level, it's where you take some of the ideas and constructs that are kind of in the consumer society and explicitly kind of flip them. So one of the things I've been sort of working on and toying with for quite a while is the question of like, how can what is the consumer confidence index as a measure of success of society, and what is it doing? And what would a citizen confidence index look like in its place? And this is this has become quite it's an inquiry that's sort of taken me deep into economic theory and so forth. And you're like, and there's it's really fascinating. You're like, the way consumer confidence works, it's an indicator of GDP, and there's a lot of attention to GDP. It's actually a perfect example of what I'm talking about. There's a lot of attention to GDP, right? There was the Stiglitz Commission in 2008 saying that GDP is like a country steering its course by GDP is like a pilot steering a course with a broken compass. That was like 2008. And I mean, Bobby Kennedy, 1968 or something, the famous quote about
a brilliant quote.
Like, yeah. but that stuff but what hasn't,
it's still there. It's still at the centre.
Exactly. and unless you, so what I'm interested in is, okay, and yes, we've had index of sustainable economic welfare, and we've had these and we've had these things, but what hasn't happened is people gone, well, actually, what story is that embedded in, and what else is supporting that story? What's the ecosystem of measures, not just the single famous one? Because and where I got to was consumer confidence is very powerful, because what consumer confidence does is, even more than GDP, it carries the narrative about what the role of people is in relation to GDP. So it says the growth is the essential. GDP says that, but then consumer confidence says the way that we attain growth is by people consuming more.
Yeah.
And unless you address that, and what's interesting is that is the thing that the sort of the mainstream media can attach to, can understand, and it's what they use constantly to translate growth economics as a whole into popular culture, into the evening news. So just this week. So we're speaking at the end of the week where the shops reopened, right? And
Boris go shopping, wasn't it?
Not just Boris go shopping, but then Channel 4 News, even like the news outlet that's arguably most sort of critical and independent thinking, was still just trotting out like the trope that the economy is we're in deep economic trouble, and therefore what people need to do is go shopping. And you're like, is it though? And because when you start to dig into this, you find people like Adair Turner, like the big names in the economic world. You find some ex Lehman Brothers folk talking about how the story of people as consumers, and the idea that consumption-driven growth is what we should seek, as a key driver of the financial crisis in 2008. Because the morality of like trying to drive consumption in order to drive growth is what sort of unlocked the subprime mortgages as an industry. And so I should pull away from this, but I guess the point is to say, like, if you stare at that and you really get into that, then you start to be able to go, okay, so what if what's that as an intervention point? And what if you design the measure around the not around the question, like the meta question of the consumer confidence index that is made up of several measures, but the meta question is how confident you can buy more stuff in the future than you have in the past. What if you design a set of measures around something like how confident are you that you have agency, that you can shape the world you live in, that you have a meaningful, you're able to do something in the world, you're able to pursue a purpose. Like if you can construct something around that, and you can start to embed it in places, and we're starting to work with a group of various local authorities to sort of bring that into their ways of measuring their effectiveness, then suddenly you drive a whole different story. But you don't just sort of create something, you also dismantle something.
And I guess, we can get into, because I want to just I want to bring it back to just you explaining the new citizenship work, and then we can get into I'd love you to talk through the subject to consumer to citizen story, because I think that's more people need to hear this, because it's brilliant the way you've kind of made sense of this. But just quickly, but in order for that to happen, I mean, and again, we'll get onto this local piece as well, because that feels like such a key area. But then it's dismantling the numbers story, right? The money story, because I guess that's where people tend to go, is that, well, yeah, but the economy is all about money, and how are we going to pay, you know what I mean? And it's sort of so this letting go, this sort of, and I think I was talking recently to Cassie Robinson about this sort of. Yeah, there's sort of, there's also a sense of some things that we need to get better at talking about, like what things need to die, like what things do we need to let go of as a culture, and or what are we prepared to sort of explore as people, to go, actually, well, maybe this habit or this behavior or this belief or this industry, it's not serving anyone anymore, and how do we kind of put that to bed, but with a bit of grace, and you know what I mean, and versus what you see out in the media, which is, well, but all these jobs, and you're just like, well, there are, with intention, you can start to see how these transitions can happen, but it's very polarizing, isn't it? And we'll get into that, I guess. Oh, we could get in deep here.
I mean, if I like, maybe I can bridge from what you're just saying about money system and so forth to the subject consumer citizen thing, because I think what I love about and what I'm most excited by in the ideas that I work with, that we work with at New Citizenship, and that increasingly I'm starting to bring into politics a bit, is that they feel they're very accessible ideas, right? Like, and they're also very empowering. So whereas like the moment you go like, we need to change the money system, or we need to dismantle capitalism, or whatever, I'm like, oh wow, like, and you end up, one of the big like the things I'm most wary of is this, this language that people use where they say post something, and like where post capitalism, post liberalism, post whatever, and you're like
post consumerism,
exactly, and you're like, you're saying that because you don't have something positive to offer. You're like, it's you're and you don't know what you're trying, you don't know what you're describing, you're just anti something is my sort of my take, to be honest. And I think the thing there's a lovely moment, and this is where the subject consumer citizen came in. It's like I went through a really dark time, and I think you and I were in touch during this, where, like, when I left advertising, like when I wrote that Think of Me as Evil paper, and when I did the My Farm thing, actually it was a binary opposition, consumer versus citizen, and it was like black and white, and nothing is like that really. And it was this moment I had in actually chatting with my mum about it when I was really down, and I'd gone to stay with my parents for a little bit, and she said. She said, sort of, I do wonder why you get so against this stuff, like, and sometimes I feel like worried about you for it, because when I was growing up, this was, and for me as a woman born in the early 50s, like this consumerism was amazing. Like consumerism was hugely liberal, and she told me like the first washing machine that we got when we were a family, when I was tiny. They got a washing machine called the Hot Point Liberator.
Brilliant.
And she was
like, marketing right there.
Exactly, it's great. And she was like, and it deserved that name, right? Because and I think, and it just made me go, oh, what? Like, and then I started digging into sort of, okay, consumer, because the other thing is people tell you that we've always been consumers, that humans are consumers, and then you go, but no, we haven't. Like, and then you go, what came before? And basically through sort of inquiring into that, and I developed this framework that's, as you say, is subject consumer citizen. So the idea is like, very simply put, kind of end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, we were something like subjects, and arguably for a very long time before. And I think of these as kind of moral stories, like ideas about what is right, or self stories, like ideas about what our role is in relation to society. And so in a subject story, the right thing to do is to keep your head down, do as you're told, get what you're given. We obey and receive. Leaders command us, like all of that stuff. And that story kind of was deeply limiting. There's no kind of creativity in that story, because you're not a creative agent. There's not really any moral agency in that story, because you just get told what to do. And so sort of through the two world wars, like that story collapses as people are sort of, we see the kind of the lie of there being a fundamental difference, the lie that there is a kind of God-given few who should tell the rest of us what to do when we're side by side in the trenches. And then coming out of the two world wars, you get this story of the consumer, and it's really there's some amazing stories about kind of the late 40s, early 50s, and how that story was kind of constructed. But that in that story, so if you contrast it with subject, so if subject is keep your head down, do as you're told, consumer is something like look out for yourself, look out for number one, get the best deal for yourself, choose the option that best suits you from those who are offered. Because if everyone does that, the best society will result. Not as a sort of a kind of co-option of or a diminishment of humanity, but on a kind of hypothesis, on an idea that actually is going to unleash us all. And
that's and just be clear, because that's beyond. I mean, that's so deep, right? It's beyond just like the stuff we buy. It's the education we try and get. It's the way we look at work. It's often, all of it tends to, well, at least the way I look at the world over the years, is sort of get ahead, right? Or get something that no one else has got.
Exactly.
Or, do you know what I mean?
Exactly. And this story has its yes, and this is what I mean when I talk about these things as frames and narratives, not just as, people use the word consumerism and they mean kind of excessive consumption, and we're lazy with that language. When I use the word consumerism, I think of it with a capital C and a hyphen between consumer and ism, and it's like it's the story that exists, it's the society that exists when consumer is by so much the dominant idea or identity construct that it comes to shape every interaction we have.
Yeah.
And so so exactly as you say. So and what I'd argue we're in now is just as the subject story kind of collapsed before and the consumer story emerged from within it. And by the way, there was a whole kind of intellectual genesis of that in Darwin and others. And now what I'd argue is happening is the consumer story is collapsing and the citizen story is emerging and could emerge. Or rather, I'd argue that was what was that sort of broad historical moment, from a shift from subject to consumer that was more or less complete, and then a shift from consumer to citizen that was emerging and trying to form but not yet ready. That, I would argue, is where we were on about, well, depending where you are in the world, kind of end of 2019 or up until about March the 10th in the UK.
Yes.
And then the whole thing has just been thrown into the crucible, thrown into the melting pot in the last few months. But the idea of the citizen, so if the subject is like, keep your head down, as you're told, consumers, look out for number one, citizen emerges from the ashes of that story and says, no, we're bigger than that and better than that. The right thing to do is to get involved, like to shape the context of your own life, to contribute your view into the big debate about what the collective interest is. And so if subject says you're not good enough to have a view and you're not creative enough to contribute anything, consumerism says you're good enough to choose what's best for you and you're creative enough to choose between things, but you're only good enough to know your own interest, not the collective interest. Then citizen says, no, actually, we're creative enough not just to choose between things, but to shape what the choices are, and we're good enough not just to know what's our own self-interest, but to contribute to the understanding of the collective interest. And actually, but by our very nature, we can and want to do that. If only we stop telling ourselves we're consumers all the time.
So, what, like, in the last, let's say, since pandemic, since lockdown, what's happened to this story as far as you can sense and make out? Like, what is, because it feels like there's so much happening, and yet at the same time it also feels like there's this real there's still sort of power. As a friend of mine used this phrase that, there's still, the beast is still lashing its tail. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of like, so there's sort of like, what's your sense? What's been happening for you during these months around this shift? Like, to tell me some, where you think some signals and just a sense of it. And also, I know that you've been super active as well. Like, we'll get onto that because you've been writing a lot as well in the last few weeks, which has been super interesting to see how that's been traveling. But just on this consumer to citizen story, can you tell me a little bit about what you're sensing and seeing is happening?
Yeah,
and where the possibility is?
I mean, I think what the way I would describe it is, like I say, from it being a kind of broad historical moment of a shift from one to the next, that it suddenly became a kind of a chaotic, like, a moment when all three stories were suddenly in play, and arguably both subject and citizen in particular became accentuated versions of themselves. So lockdown is the ultimate kind of subject moment, like in many ways. It's sort of suddenly, and the enhanced power of the state, the kind of the willing embrace really of the restrictions on deep restrictions on civil liberties. The kind of that was a incredible kind of subject moment, and it's because subject isn't a kind of necessarily a sort of evil thing, but it is deeply paternalistic. It's deeply it's a story that is of limits our agency. And I think that went big and is still there, right? Like we've had this shock, and it's still very much there.
I was listening to a thing last night on some webinar thing with Paul Hawken on it, and he was talking from the US, being in the US right now. But he was just, the language he was using. We're in a deep trauma.
Yeah.
Right now we're sort of like, he really felt that there's a moment of trauma, but there's this sort of moment of learning that's there as well. But sorry, I just thought it was interesting. As I say,
I'd love to come to that a bit more, actually, because I've been there's this idea of like there's a maybe let's go there a little bit now. Really interesting, wonderful book that I would recommend to you and anyone who listens to you ever, and anyone who listens to me ever. Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell. It's basically she died in 2009, shortly after Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath, and sort of digging into the aftermath of that. She was kind of inquiring into like what is human nature, and what happens in the aftermath of crisis that can teach us about human nature, and the sort of the way we think about crisis and trauma is we think of them as we take the conventional wisdom is that crisis is something that brings out the worst in people, that civilization is the sort of is the protection from ourselves, and in crisis, civilization is kind of the thin veneer is torn off, and we're red in tooth and claw, and we eat one another. And what Solnit kind of describes and evidences really deeply. You go into, and in crisis, that's not what happens. What happens is that people come together, and people find one another, and people help one another, and people love the experience of losing their narrow self-interest and finding a bigger collective self-interest. And actually the kind of the trappings being torn makes that possible rather than renders it impossible. And she goes on to talk about this trauma thing that you're just mentioning. Like, we tend to think of trauma like PTSD, like post-traumatic stress trauma, as a negative, which it is, and this is a tragic time in so many ways. And yet she talks about there's a growing kind of understanding of the idea of post-traumatic growth. That actually these experiences of kind of having our understanding of ourselves kind of wrenched open is in many cases a kind of a moment for deep, like a major expansion.
Yeah, there's a breakthrough possibility.
Exactly, breakthrough, not breakdown, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's so to the subject consumer citizen thing. You're like, the breakdown place that we might go is arguably subject, is sort of a step back, a kind of, and you can see the appeal of it, the kind of the lure of being told what to do in times of such drastic uncertainty, and the lure of giving up our agency in order to and giving it up to someone else who offers to take it from us, can feel like giving up a burden. And that's one place this could go. The consumer thing, I think, is in a similar sort of space, really, but subtly different. It's like the kind of no, we just have to do what we have to go back to. Is the sort of we just have to do what we always did. We have to accept that humans are selfish and actually that and we have to go back to economic growth as the thing, and we have to pretend we haven't seen what we've seen. And then the citizen story is the one that is in mutual aid and is in these connections that we've made to one another, and the form and the ways that our families have linked across distance, and is in all this stuff, and that says and is in the sort of organizational renewal and reinvention that's been happening. and that says, no, hang on a minute, like the worst has happened, and at least until such time as the sort of the authority has tried to reestablish itself, at least until that moment, we found ourselves wonderfully. We found and we were able to do something very special. Yes, in tragic circumstances that you would never wish. I'm not saying that, but we've seen an opportunity.
But that's also, you know, a deeply human story, right? Because I was listening again. It was Janine Benyus was talking about how you know thinking in a kind of living systems or just as living beings. You know, if you have any kind of trauma in the body, for example, you know, an injury, a cut, or whatever. You know, the energy, everything in the body goes to that trauma, tries to repair it, protect it. You know, it works from the weakest point. It's you know what I mean. It tries to support that, and it was interesting thinking about this. You know, how we're responding, and to your story, you know, where you know there's this sort of the human story that wants to go and support the most vulnerable, where where the pain is, where the suffering is.
That's beautiful.
But then the subject story, as you're talking, seems to, you know, wants us to sort of get back to sort of get ahead. You know, we can't look after everyone, and which actually clashes really with sort of how life maybe wants to work, which really struck me as an interesting way of thinking about it.
I think that's right. I mean, I guess I draw a slight distinction because I think the subject future and the consumer future are distinct in that.
Right.
In that I think the subject future is a kind of so I don't know if you've seen the work that the long crisis, and I'd really recommend this again to folks, the long crisis scenarios that Alex Evans from the Collective Psychology Project and a whole group of other people have been working on.
But tell us a bit about those.
Sorry?
Tell us a little bit about that.
So what they've done is they've essentially argued that the two biggest deciding factors in what happens next are whether the solutions and the approach that we decide to take are centralized or distributed, and whether the values that underpin the approach that's taken are collaborative or individualistic. And
so that's central to local piece. I mean, that plays out. You could argue, like just looking at the UK, right? Like, for example, you know, coronavirus testing, right?
Yeah.
Centralized.
Super right? Yeah. If you
PPE, centralized. So there's even just in very, very obviously very just sort of, you know, specific kind of actions, but that's taken that approach of central power knows better.
Yeah, exactly. And central power knows better is very much a subject thesis, like a subject idea, the sort of the building block of that. Whereas I think and I think where that leads you to more, and so they're in their scenarios, they sort of talk about three that I think are kind of, well, there's four scenarios they get to from that. The worst of them, shall we say, is the kind of centralized but kind of individualistic values, and they call that the kind of the rise of the oligarchs, and we can certainly see that, right? Like, it's a really dark place. The centralized but sort of more collaborative values, I'm not a huge fan of the title they've given it. They called it the Big Mother scenario, the kind of the sort of the nurturing, the sort of hugely centralized but maybe kind of over restrictive state.
Right.
And I guess if you chose to believe that and I think this is where a lot of the appeal to certain parts of society comes from, of things like the sort of the centralized app and the centralized PPE and so forth. It's like, and I think that a big appeal of that is among the elder generation, and that sort of stuff, that we've seen data for this, that that actually like there's a desire to believe that responsibility can just be served somewhere far away from me, and make sure that I can just that just tells me what to do, and I'll stick to my
protects
work.
me, sorts me out. I'm fine. We're all fine.
Exactly. And then, but when you go to the decentralized kind of world, you get, I think that's, if you decentralize the individualistic, that's where you get into the sort of consumer thing, where it's like everyone looks out for themselves. And in some places that sort of coheres into some good, some vaguely kind of positive and generative things, but not in any way that's commensurate with the scale of the challenges we face. And that, I think, is the picture of the consumer type future. They call it fragile, resilient. And then the place that where the citizen story lies, where it's decentralized and collaborative, where we can where we sort of is a mess, but an intentional mess, a bit like nature to the analogy.
Yeah.
Like, and it's and that the guys, the long crisis team have called it winning ugly as a scenario, which I think is a really lovely idea of that we might hold and explore, of kind of what world we could create in this time. It's not going to be a kind of an orderly utopia, at least in the conventional sense of the word orderly, but it might be an organic kind of shared intent, deeply localized, very distributed, but with some degree of kind of shared value and shared values and shared understanding, that we can actually build something very special.
It's so interesting. So this stuff for me is like, again, it's like the messiness that you're talking to. So I get a sense, I guess this also taps into the work you do, that we've the sort of the consumerist sort of subject consumerist story, whatever, has in many ways created this sort of obedient culture, right? It's sort of, I mean, it's just interesting seeing it play out on lots of different levels, where you sort of, you kind of, you feel like you're being told what you need to do all the time in order to sort of progress through this sort of linear view of life, pass this exam, get this job, whatever it might be, right? And actually, when you start to take that away, so it's been fascinating just from personally, just like what's been happening with like trying to homeschool over the last 3 months, and seeing these kind of quietly, deeply ingrained, this is sort of even the obedience of being in the school system, and actually not kind of knowing how to sort of, when you're suddenly out of that, how do you actually start, how do you self-direct yourself? Do you know what I mean? How do you... And that's been fascinating watching the kids there. But I see that in our culture, in our society, these, people are looking to be told what to do. But I think as as I know your work, and, we've crossed a lot on this whole area of inquiry-based ways of living and working. But actually when you have practices and techniques and peer support and whatever, then the messiness it can be really joyful. I mean, it's painful as well, but it can be quite joyful, because you're actually participating your way into this emerging world, versus waiting to be told which way to go in. Do you know what I mean? One of the things that I'm sort of really curious in at the moment is how might we, and obviously there's examples that play all over the place, but it's almost like when I think of where this stuff's going, I think, well, you've got to be able to somehow support the car crash that's going to keep coming for the next probably couple of years, and how do you support the most vulnerable to sort of, just to be able to sort of, just hold all of this uncertainty and messiness, and not have to worry about, can I feed myself and my children, and do you know what I mean? And then can I house myself? And then, and then you can start to think about, like, how do we start to imagine our way out of this stuff, and how do we, a place-based level.
I don't know. I hear you, and then I think that the idea, there's something really. I've suddenly become, like, in this moment, and just in listening to in what we're talking about, like, suddenly feeling conscious again that we're two white guys having this conversation, and I think that's, and I'm not trying to, but there is something, there's something in this moment, like, I don't think it's it's not an unrelated thing that Black Lives Matter is happening now,
Sure.
and the narratives of, for example, kind of the indigenous wisdom of are really coming through. Whether it's people like Edgar Villanueva in the States with his book Decolonizing Wealth, and kind of and understand, and the sort of redesign the real depth that sits behind arguments to sort of defund the police or even abandon traditional policing systems that come from that often the insight and the ideas come from don't like and I'm not trying to call you or anything like that. I'm like, there's something in what you're saying that sort of feels like, and I think I've held it myself, a sort of assumption that we have to be to some degree safe, or to a great degree.
Well, I guess though, but to that point, I guess what I'm saying is, how do you right now that people have no land ownership, there's no way to cultivate food, there's no way to there's no ownership of property. That's the whole thing is rigged towards white people and people with existing in this power structure. So if you're either going to have a total collapse, or you've got to find ways to, like I say, to allow people to create the world they want to create. But there are fundamental things that are, how's that going to, how can you create the ability for people to take control and participate when the basics of survival are so inaccessible currently? I guess that's where I'm coming from, rather than, because I'm much more, I totally agree. It's not about trying to sort of mandate a vision and a process and a way of doing it. But what I look at the moment is that how do you, in order to be able to sort of, it's almost like that, what you talked about, you have this thing about how, in order to see a world beyond advertising, you've got to create the spaces where advertising doesn't exist. But I guess that's my thing that worries me. Not worries me, but I mean, it's just I
hear you. I think this is so. When you were talking to me about what we might do on this, we were talking. It was like, what's the edge of the learning is always the question, right? Like what? And I think this is absolutely it. It's like. And I guess where I am, so I think I saw you write about it, and I've read it, and I come across it in a couple other places, a piece by a guy called Vinay Gupta recently.
Yes.
Talking about his sort of diagnosis of this moment, and the kind of the structural kind of exploitation, and where he got to was the sort of proposition that we should try and enshrine everything around the rights of the child.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating. Like, I found it. There's a moment in the piece, in Gupta's piece, where he sort of he does. I mean, it's for those, if you haven't read it, again, you should. Like, it's speaking to your listeners. Like, there's this the very powerful kind of deconstruction of the sort of favor breeds favor structures that are in the kind of in among the kind of elite structures of our societies, but where he gets to as a result of that, he says we will only. He sort of asserts in the midst of an argument, he asserts that we won't save ourselves in the sort of oncoming climate emergency unless we are mandated to. And I found that a really fascinating moment in reading it, where it stopped me, and I was like, I don't believe that. And I think this does come back to the kind of the fundamentals the fundamental belief that I have is that, well, two fundamental beliefs I have. Firstly, that humans are by nature citizens. Like, we are collaborative, empathic creatures who want to do stuff together and the second is that that we're shaped by the stories that surround us, and currently we surround ourselves with some pretty poisonous stories. Now, if you take that into this situation that you were just describing, we were talking into, I think, and look at that Gupta thing, I think what he's saying, where he gets to, he's coming from a different set of belief. He's coming from a belief that goes, these people who are perpetrating this stuff, if not necessarily everybody else, but certainly these people, are fundamentally not good. And I think I am like, I think I'm coming maybe from a and I hear that and I see that and I understand that, and I know that he's worked in refugee camps and he's seen some bad stuff.
Yeah.
And yet I'm like, I don't believe that. I don't believe it. Like I think there are maybe not in the extreme spaces, but in the vast range of spaces between, there is first and foremost there are tastes of power. There are elements of agency that we all have that we can start working with. And then on the other side of that can be seen as the enemy, there are people who also are limited in what they can do and in how much they can like themselves by the patterns and the stories that they've been living in. And therefore there are incentives there as well to open up. And if we can create those sorts of spaces, if we can come into this moment believing in one another as citizens, I mean, you look at some of the amazing things we've seen over the last few weeks. The kind of the sheriffs walking with the protesters in the States. The Black Lives Matter protester throwing the far white protester over his shoulder. Did you see the Metro headline? "He ain't heavy." I just love that, and like the kind of the spirit that's there. That if we can, so where I'm not being terribly articulate because this is the kind of edge of it, right? But like,
yeah, right. I mean, it's messy as hell. But when you sort of also see, you look at sort of British colonial history being unpicked now at the moment,
right.
like, and what's going on there, and where's that going to go? Because
right.
that, again, I guess that's it. This thing is unraveling on multiple fronts, and so I
guess what I'm saying is there's sort of two ways. Like there's a way that insists on there's a way that sort of goes, we need to impose a law, we need to find a principle that we can organise by and impose that on ourselves. And I think that's where Gupta's coming from. And to my mind, there's a different way, which is to insist on, almost belligerently insist on the kind of the goodness of the human, and insist on starting from there and going, and that is what I think takes you to a decentralized, distributed kind of place, and allows you to go, this there is space for this to emerge. It may not look like it, and the more abstract you make it, the more you zoom out, the less it looks like there is space. But the more you zoom in, the more, like with that new Citizenship Project, we've been and worked in council estates in Huddersfield that are known as being some of that had been kind of heartlands of quite unpleasant stuff. But you can, like, Huddersfield's an amazing city, that whole region of Kirklees is just phenomenal, and the people we met and found and the stories that we heard and the passion that we saw. And the ability to kind of, when people allowed themselves to be side by side, the energy that unlocks is phenomenal. And I guess that's my take, is like, I think that's the edge of this.
So where's it happening for you? Like where are we seeing this emerging world of the citizen today? Like, what can you share some stories?
Yeah, sure. I mean, globally, I think that Taiwan in particular is a fascinating case. And so if people, again, one of my heroes, I think, in this moment, as for an increasing number of people, I think is a woman called Audrey Tang, who's the digital minister of Taiwan, used to be the leader of the protest movement there. And then became part of government, and what Taiwan have done effectively, they talk about their national approach to coronavirus as being fast, fun, and fair, and they see it as an ongoing shared inquiry of all the citizens into how we can keep each other safe. And they stopped flights from on the 1st of January. They'd already stopped flights from Wuhan. The sort of precautionary principle, because we need to look after each other, also knowing about SARS and previous experience and so forth. But then they've created a kind of a hotline, a simple, like what Tang talks about. She's like ultimate technologist, but she says that the two most important technologies they've used have been the telephone and the television. and they created a 5-digit phone number where any citizen could ring in with ideas for how to make the national response better. And then there's a daily televised press conference, as there are in so many places. But in this one, wherever possible, they try and refer to the ideas that they've got and improve the thing. So there's this lovely story of someone a kid phoning in and saying that he didn't want to go to school because all of the regulation issue face masks were pink, and this little boy didn't want to wear a pink face mask. And so the next day at the press conference, all of the ministers were wearing pink face masks, and they got a bunch of baseball players to come on with their super macho hero baseball players to come on with their face masks. And you're like, imagine, and they haven't had a lockdown, right? Because they haven't needed to, because they have seen themselves as all in it, and precautionary principle, not needing to get there, not desiring to put people in that situation. So that's an amazing one. Highly recommend.
And that's that kind of, I guess, that, again, so there's a sort of relationship going on between state and citizen. And there's an element of kind of transparency, I guess, almost because people are, there's a response, there's a feedback that's happening between.
Yeah. But on that, I love the way Audrey Tang puts it in the interview she did recently with Matthew Taylor, that I highly recommend. I think it's called Bridges to the Future, the podcast series. But she says that it's not about citizens trusting government; it's about the government trusting the citizens. Right.
Yeah, and I guess that, so in Taiwan, has that been something, is that relationship been developing over time? It was there as the pandemic sort of kicked in.
Yeah, but only since there was effectively a kind of revolution. It was, I sometimes talk about it as the country where Occupy won. I've been writing about it for the last 4 or 5 years and have spoken to various people there. But yeah, the story only starts in 2012, when the government at the time produced some ads saying, "Shush, little people, just go shopping," effectively, and a group of hackers formed and started to hack government websites and set up alternative versions, and eventually kind of it culminated in an Occupy style protest in 2014, and then the government shifting and changing and inviting some of the hackers and the movement builders into government. So it's not in the dim and distant past. It's pretty recent. And I mean, Iceland is another case in point on a world scale, but coming more locally and into Britain, I think it's sort of, this is why in my work at the moment I am supremely excited by and very focused on local government. Which I mean, when you and I first met each other, would never have been on the radar, right? No. But if anyone working in advertising listens to your thing, the job you should go and take is go and work in communications in local government, because they need great people, but they are doing this is where the most important work in this country will be done, certainly in the next 2 to 3 years, probably for the next 5. Until such time as we have a general election, it's the only way. It's the
only way to change. It's the only place that you can actually make shit happen, right?
But also because it is genuinely where there is power to unlock the agency of citizens. Because I mean, we've been working as New Citizenship Project. We've been working with Kirklees Council for the last year or so, in particular, and with 1 or 2 others. But some of the things we've seen and been able to be part of, just the simple act of working with people and to go and run a conversation where you ask, we simply ask the question, when have you felt proud of the place where you live, and sort of held a space for that conversation. And by the end of the conversation, and we had some people in the room who from the council who could offer examples of how people might organise themselves. There was no money, nothing really in the room. But by the end of the session, a Tenants and Residents Association had restarted in the room. A festival started to be planned. And you're like, these things are it can be everywhere. I've come across, just in the last week, I met a guy called Billy Desane, who's one of the kind of conveners of a group called the East Martians from East Marsh, which is a pretty not well looked after by the state, and not well regarded by the nation, part of Grimsby, and they're doing almost the same sort of stuff and doing it awesomely. And like, there's energy everywhere in this country, and particularly now with the it's not even the memory of mutual aid, is it? It's the current reality of mutual aid. And I think that's why. So I've just written one of the pieces I wrote recently. I mean, you referred to some of the writing I've been doing, and some of it's got more attention than this. But the piece I've written on local government and how local authorities can step into a citizen future, because I think that the place of councils, the place of councillors, the place of local authority staff in shifting their mindsets and opening up possibility is enormous, and they really want to do it. So it's just a massive gimme.
You've talked a little bit, I think, or is it rapid democracy? I've heard you writing about recently. What's that all about?
Oh, mate, it's just I can barely. My brain is spinning at the moment because I'm so excited by what's possible, and yet. So the rapid democracy is a whole nother. This is basically going like just trying to conceive of a way that a particular process could be run on a local level or on a national level, frankly, which is to say, like, there's a lot of talk about deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies at the moment, and these are really important mechanics. But what I'm particularly excited by is the idea that, but put it into context. So the most recent piece I've written about this was in the context of the Colston statue coming down and going into the harbour in Bristol, yeah. And Marvin Rees, the mayor, came out and said, I want to run a citywide conversation. So I've briefed some academics to come up with a research paper. And you're like, interesting. Citywide conversation, research paper.
City academics.
Exactly, city academics conversation.
It's not very citizen-ish,
no,
is it?
Quite. And I'm not like it's a yes and thing, right? Like Marvin Rees has done wonderful things and held the space brilliantly. But what I was throwing into that was, well, what if you could run a process that would genuinely offer the ability for the right kinds of participation at the right stage of the process? And so I borrowed the model from Bain, I think it was back in the 90s, wrote a paper on corporate decision making called RAPID, which is an acronym. So the acronym stands for recommend, agree, perform, input, and decide. And the whole idea is that people mistake decision making. They think decision making is just one thing, making a decision, but actually there are multiple phases to that process. And their argument was, when corporations go wrong is when too many of those processes sit with a single actor, often the CEO. And so I basically all I've done is transpose that analysis onto democracy and go, too many of the actions, too many of the roles in a decision-making process sit with too few actors. Arguably, MPs, and even increasingly under the influence of the current government, which I would argue is not even a Conservative government, but anyway, is within the executive, not even in Parliament. But in the context of Bristol, it's to say too many of the decision making roles reside in the councillors and the mayor. So what if you broke those things out and you said, let's have an input process first. Let's open out for ideas from everyone. How could and should Bristol face into its racial history? And yes, that's about what statues should be where and so forth, and what should happen in there. But it can also be about, like, how could schools work together differently? How could the city have a different relation to other places in the world? You could imagine lots of different, and those ideas can come from wherever anyone has an idea. And then there are platforms that are designed and open source for that sort of thing. Then you have a recommend process where you do need a citizens assembly type process. You need a representative sample arguably leaning towards the racial context, that you need to get a recommendation out, then you need a decision. And that decision is still the right role, just as in a corporation, it would still be the role of the CEO, is still the right role for the elected representatives. And then, so they still have a role, but only one of the many roles. And then you need,
and you're effectively you're approaching them for decision making after you've gone very wide, and you've sort of,
but not just very wide for feedback on something they've already thought of, but very wide for input.
To say what's important.
What do we want to do here? What matters to us? Because we all have a stake in that.
Yeah.
And the ability of that sort of thing to create power.
So, like, I mean, so, you know, because obviously, I've been sort of exploring, you know, co-creation and open design and stuff, and what through the Good for Nothing project, and we've had a lot of focus on local cities and chapters, and it's so fascinating for me. You see all these, and as you said, there's all these platforms and open source tools, and there's all this stuff out there, and there's pockets of people that again, I live in Bath, right? It's like, and I see all these, you see all these things. There's this group that have been looking at traffic and, low traffic neighborhoods. And, there's a commonplace that just platform that just got put out 3 weeks ago. And, all these people are now sort of marking the map. Like, what do they want to see happen? What do they want to change? What? So there's, that's just one example. Then you've got groups that are looking at, air pollution. You've got groups looking at food. But it always seems to be, and I guess so. You've got all this possibility in all these networks, but convening always seems just a complete nightmare. Like, I don't know. It's just like trying to you've sort of got all the elements, but actually, how do you bite off a chunk that's I don't know. Maybe I'm just talking myself out of this, but I guess because I'm exploring this. I'm really feeling this at the moment. Like, even in my own my own life or my own patch. What should I be doing, knowing what I know, or knowing networks in the city that I can see? And, we had a Black Lives Matters demo in Green Park in Bath 2 weeks ago. There was 1,000 people. One of the speakers said this would be unimaginable in Bath 2 years ago,
Yeah.
And there's all these networks. We've got very strong XR groups in Bath. We've got a very strong youth climate strike movement. There's all these groups. And I know they've been sort of individually looking, but I guess to that question you're saying, it's like, it does feel though, but unless, whatever comes out, whatever is becoming, what we now participate and co-create and this shift to citizens, at least my understanding from, listening and watching and learning and reading is that unless we, those that have been really screwed by the old system aren't right front and center in the mix, we just will keep making the same mistakes. And I think that's an interesting thing right now. How do we make those bridges? Do you know what I mean? Between,
I mean, I think for me, this is why I'm so passionate, again, as I say, about local government, because that's the place where this stuff interfaces with still really genuine power. And that's so like if I don't know, if I had my, there was I can't remember who it was. There was a phenomenally powerful thing. I'll try and dig it out and find it. But there's this moment where I think it was a mayor of a US city said to protesters, black mayor said to protesters, do you know what? Like, protest all you like, do what you like, great, let's make the noise, let's keep the noise going, but what I want is at least a bunch of you guys to run for office, right? Like, you need to get involved. Like, we need you in here. I need you to be shouting at me directly. I need you to be representing yourselves and yourself in this space. And I think, like, I felt torn about this in the past, because you're like, well, but we know the system needs to change. We know, but the fundamental, like, so many of these structures are actually exactly what we've been waiting for, but have been kind of hidden in terrible language and terrible processes and terrible design. And it's only if we can, and my take at the moment is like, well, I'm pretty convinced by it, is like, how we need to step into that and reshape it. And I think this is what things like flat pack democracy, the Froome stuff is all about. Like, and also Taiwan, right? Like Audrey Tang stepping over as from protest into government. Like that wasn't just that you can sort of see that as something that government did that was very brave, but it's also something she did that was very brave.
So who's giving you hope here in the UK? Like what's making your heart kind of, pop a bit in terms of, as we look at this? Obviously, you're my hero in this space, by the way. But, no, but you know what I mean.
We're doomed.
No, but I mean, what are there? What are you seeing at the moment that's really getting you excited? Can you speak to sort of, some specific things or people that we should be looking at or checking out that are sort of really bringing this thing to life right now, that are kind of really helping this shift, and particularly at this local level? Because I'm completely with you. I mean, you know how my head was. I'm very much into looking at how the non-human world works and thinking, what can we do? And obviously, nature doesn't do like scale; it localizes, and it's this local for me feels absolutely like this. Feels like if we're going to shift to something different, it will be these, I think that, it's like Schumacher would call it, the 2 million villages idea. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
All sort of connected up, with a sort of, a sort of maybe a vision, maybe sharing a vision of the type of paradigm that we're trying to go towards, but actually having like vast amounts of flavors and ideas and differences depending on, the diversity of a place. And so all that goodness, but the local piece does, totally with you. It feels like such an integral part, and particularly when we look at from a system perspective where we are in this country, and the current election systems and centralization. And we got you can't shift that, but like you say, you can. The changes are happening, and they can happen, and that's how we'll build something. But what else is going on that's really kind of getting you excited in the UK?
Do you know, it's a funny question. It's like.
I always ask funny questions.
Yeah, no, I think what I really want to answer is in a sort of almost politician-like way.
Go on, Jon.
Say like, I almost don't want to pick out any one thing, because I think so if your question is like, what should we look at? I think that was you sort of dropped that into when you were just talking. You said, what should we look at? I would say, look where you are, and look for this sort of thing. Look for the community. Look for the councillors who are most open-minded, who are trying to open conversations and attend the local events and don't really know how to do it, but want to. Look for the community groups that are and the protests that are trying to sort of. That are trying to involve the people in positions of power and trying to invite their local representatives in, and sort of, or the people who from within those movements are considering standing themselves either as independents or getting involved in a political party. And frankly, it doesn't really matter which in so much to my mind. Look for for what it's worth, like on that, like I'm a member of the Liberal Democrats, and I'm keen to try and, frankly, what I'm working with is trying to sort of put this work at the heart of that party, because I believe that was where it was growing under Paddy Ashdown Paddy Ashdown wrote a book called Citizens Britain in 1989 with the subtitle A Radical Agenda for the 1990s, talking about universal basic income and citizen shareholdings and genuinely meaningful devolution and so on and so forth. And
that's what I mean. But that's what I mean to exactly that. Like these ideas, like again, in order for people to co-create this future that they want, that you those things like UBI or whatever the involvement of them, they just feel so critical, because it's almost impossible to step into that space of possibility if you can't feed yourself, or you know what I mean.
I don't mean to be glib. I'm not by any means dismissing that, but I think and so the thing so at some level in that way I do agree with you, and I like what I'm personally am moving a bit not away from, but sort of complementing the new Citizenship Project work, which has a local government aspect, but is also with businesses and of various sorts, whether it's the co-op and with charities like Parkinson's UK and others. But also, I'm starting to work more politically, and I'm working with a guy called Ian Kearns, who has just taken over as director of a thing called the Social Liberal Forum, which is basically a space that is not about any particular political party, but is about trying to create the space to go, like, this, like, we are citizens and we want to be citizens and we want to shape the future together. And
it's a human agenda
to do that. Exactly, a human agenda. And
I like what you're saying here is like this idea of like looking for maybe people and projects that are trying to bridge a little bit, feels like, rather than that sort of, again, that kind of, you know, the sort of siloed way of doing. I guess that's, it's interesting that, because I think that's spot on. It's like it has to, you know, where the possibility feels like is where the people are willing to you know, to have feet in different perspectives and you know, and listen and hold these different points of view and like work with them, even if they're sort of intuitively not comfortable with them. Because
I am angry with the system, and I'm gonna be inside it and change it. Like I'm comfortable in the system, and I can see the problems and challenges of it. Like the more we can make that space populated and interesting and energetic, the more chance I think we'll have.
That's brilliant. That feels like that might be our moment to, because we could speak for hours, Jon, but we'll have to, which we'll do. But I'm conscious of time, and how, you know, I can link to your work and whatever. But are there anything coming up that folks could get involved in, or anything you want to point anyone to? Or
that's a good question.
I mean, you're still. I mean, the new Citizenship Project, you know, you still are involved in that, but you have built, you know, you've kind of sort of have a great team, haven't you, now that sort of take it on.
I mean, New Citizenship Project is still the best home, and there's events and kind of workshops and things that anyone that will be sending out very soon. You
publish lots of interesting reports and stuff.
Yeah, we got a lot of stuff. If you our website has a sign up for the mailing list of newcitizenship.org.uk, and we don't send much, but when we do send it, it's usually we make sure it's got some substance to it. And follow me on Jon J. Alex on Medium and Twitter, and look out. Like the biggest thing that's coming up, I think we are going to put out a report on some data we've just been gathering on the hunger that people have for a citizen approach to society as opposed to a subject to consumer approach. So that'll be coming soon under the banner of the Social Liberal Forum.
Amazing. Brilliant. Well, I'll link to that. So, you know, this Spaceship Earth podcast, I always ask this question at the end. You know, we're all kind of on this thing, hurtling through space. And this phrase of becoming crew, which I like to sort of explore with my guests, like right now, like what's for you? Like, what's that saying to people? What does that say to you?
It makes me think of Sam Conniff's work on pirates, and the idea that actually when you really understand what the Golden Age pirates were about, they were a society. They were about trying to create a better society, and one in which everyone had a stake and a say. So democracy on the pirate ships was about everyone having a say and everyone shaping what the decisions were. And I guess within that, I'm like, crew to me feels like an active rather than a passive. So it's like, if you're crew, then you're not just tribe. You're not just sort of told. You're not just sort of invisible in that. You're an active shaper of what that thing does. And so I think it says get stuck in and go. Don't be afraid of power. Go to where the power is.
Lovely. I love that, Jon. Thank you so much for this conversation. There's so much in there. I love catching up with you. You always blow my mind completely. But I love what you do, and the way you see the world and the work you do is so important. And I think it's brilliant that it's we're in this mess, but there's people like yourselves around, which makes me feel like there is a more beautiful world that can happen. So thanks for your time,
and you, brother.
And we'll be in touch.
We will.
Thanks, Jon. Right then, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jon Alexander. I certainly did. Do follow Jon's work and the new Citizenship Project work. Fascinating stuff. And yeah, Jon's work is really gaining momentum at the moment, so definitely worth getting involved. Thanks for listening. Thanks so much for your support. If you like what you're hearing, do give us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen to. It really helps more people find it. So it will take 30 seconds. That'll be lovely. And do get in touch with any thoughts or any feedback you have. It's always massively appreciated. Until next time, peace and out.